Hello and welcome to BC Referendum 2018. Are you voting for change on Shaw TV? My name is Laurel Collins, and along with my co-host, Dr. Michael Prince, we are bringing you the information you need in order to make an informed decision in the upcoming referendum on proportional representation. In the studio today, we have our guest, Sonia Furstenau. She is the Member of Parliament, or member of the Legislative Assembly for the Cowichan Valley. She's also the House Leader and the Deputy Leader for the BC Green Party. Welcome.
Thanks, Laurel. Thank you, Michael. Great to be here.
So, Sonia, your party is going to be campaigning for the yes side in the upcoming referendum. And what exactly are your plans? Why is proportional representation so important to the BC Greens?
You know, it's one of the values that is a long-standing value and principle for Green parties everywhere. And it's important because it's important for the citizens that their voices, when they go to the polls, and their choices actually inform the makeup of the legislature or the parliament. And so currently what we have in BC is a first-past-the-post system where there's two significant problems. One is that approximately 50% of votes cast in BC don't go to elect anybody. And so that means 50% of people at the end of an election feel like my vote didn't count. And this results in cynicism, it results in a lowering of the voter turnout, it results in a feeling of, I can't really have a say in my democracy. And these are very dangerous conditions for democracy. We want people to go to the polls and to feel excited about voting, to feel like knowing their vote will count and it does matter. And so we need to solve that problem. The second problem we need to solve is that in a first-past-the-post system where you have more than two parties, it means that one party can get 100% of the power with just 40% of the popular vote. And we see that over and over and over again. That's pretty much the standard outcome. We just saw it last week in Ontario, where Rob Ford's Progressive Conservatives indeed got 60% of the seats, 100% of the power, with 40% of the popular vote. That leaves 60% of voters feeling like there's a government in power, they have all of the power, and I didn't vote for them, I don't want them. So you actually have the majority of people who did not vote for the party that has all the power. Those two issues really need to be solved in our democracy, and we need to modernize our democracy, and the best way to take those steps is to start with electoral reform and proportional representation.
And we now know that the ballot is going to have two questions, one generally on whether voters want to switch to a proportional system, and the second one outlining three options, dual member proportional, mixed member proportional, and rural urban proportional representation. Do you have a preference, or is the BC Green Party going to take a position on which one they prefer over the others?
Well, we're firmly in favor of modernizing our electoral system. So yes to the first question is clearly our preference on that. In terms of the three system, there's benefits to all of them, but the parameters for the decision that the Attorney General made to put those three systems on the ballot were that they met the values of the consultation that he had. Over 90,000 people participated in that consultation. And the four key pieces that really emerged out of that consultation was that people wanted a simple system that was easy to understand. They wanted the regional representation, so you have an MLA or even two MLAs. And they wanted no significant increase to the size of the legislature. And there's a fourth one. Oh, proportionality was the fourth one. So they wanted to make sure that the system actually produces proportional results. The three systems that are on the ballot meet all of those criteria, some of them more than others. So the simplest would be mixed member proportional, whereas the proportionality in the other two systems might reach higher levels. For us, it's the great opportunity here, and it's extraordinary. You and I were talking about this. You know, I'm a historian, you're a political scientist. You're a political scientist. This is great. It's like being back at university. Very few citizens in history have been given the opportunity to say what kind of electoral system they want to have their government operate under. And it is an incredibly exciting opportunity, and I think the capacity for citizens to engage in this and to get informed and to make an informed decision, I have no doubt about that, and I'm really excited about it.
Well, you've already touched on a number of values around any kind of voting system, and as you know, as you just said, there's an opportunity for us to kind of go back to what those first principles are about electoral systems, and one of those will have to deal with the vast size of our province, the geography, the many different communities, different kind of economies we have in the province. So where do you see PR fitting in with the concern that some have about how does the rural-urban divide or distinctions, and how to make sure that regional differences are ably or properly addressed in a reform?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and you know, one is we can look to systems that exist already that have a similar kind of geography. And so Denmark is an example. They have a similar population, 5 million people, and they have the difference between the rural and the urban.
Right.
And so they have the kind of mix of rural-urban system that makes sure that those regional issues are addressed. I know that the Attorney General in his report really made it clear that this was an issue that he wanted to make sure was addressed, and the three systems do touch on that. What I think is really important to note is that currently there is a diversity of voices across BC. Every community has diverse voices. There's no one community that only thinks in a certain. But all of our communities are actually bound together by the shared values that really make up BC. And I've made a point of traveling across to BC to as many communities as I can in the last several years. We all want essentially the same things. We want good outcomes for our children. We want an environment that is safe and reliable and we can rely on for clean air, clean water, good food. We want prosperity, we want connection in our community. And so these are the values that actually connect everybody in BC. And the other thing about BC is we all really love this place. I mean, you go to any community and they talk about, this is the best community in BC.
Right.
And I think for everyone who lives in a community and is connected, their community is the best community in BC. And so we can recognize that there's not a big fear that should be informing this. We should actually be excited that those diversity of voices within those shared values can be better represented by our electoral system.
Well, could you just maybe explain to our listeners something I've noted? All three options do still involve some first past the post in them. We often hear that people are talking about scrapping first past the post, or replacing it, or throwing it out, or moving to something completely different. But when you look at the three options that are being presented, each one of them still contains, so in a way it speaks to what you're just talking about, people's pride in their local communities, people's sense of place. And so just invite you to maybe speak to that, because that really does seem to be a worry that some people have that seems to be being misrepresented or misunderstood. And
yeah, they are all a mix, and so the ballots will look fairly familiar in that one part of the ballot is going to be, you know, do you want to vote for this specific representative, just like we do right now. And so there will be, so let's take mixed member proportional, where you will elect a representative under the regular first past the post system, and then you're given a choice to choose one more from any party you want. And that second part allows for regional representation that brings proportionality into the House. So it means that you'll have an MLA in your riding and also a few more regional representatives who will make sure that our House reflects the voting. And this is great because ideally we'll have regions that have members from 2 or 3 parties, which means that if you are, you know, a dyed-in-the-wool, true blue NDP person and you don't feel comfortable going into a Liberal MLA's office, you'll have an NDP office to go into, or vice versa. And this is one of the real challenges we have right now with these giant blocks of the province being represented only by one party or another, is that in those areas, up to 50% of people didn't vote for the MLAs that are representing those areas, and they don't really feel that they have a voice.
Yeah, in many ways, the traditional first past the post system exaggerates regionalism and presents them as homogeneous or more kind of distinct. You know, it highlights the common, you know, rather than the shared values.
Absolutely, and it actually polarizes with this kind of partisan vision. And yet, the thing is, we actually share an enormous amount of shared values and shared vision and goals. And so, we want to be working on that element as opposed to the things that separate us and divide us.
Now, no matter what system of proportional representation, if it does go forward and we get a proportional system, there will likely be minority governments. And this will involve some kind of agreement between two or maybe even more political parties coming together. And this could be on an issue-by-issue basis. It could be a confidence and supply agreement like the one between your party and the NDP caucus, or it could be a more formal coalition.
Yeah.
When you have these kind of agreements and coalitions, how do citizens know who's making the decisions, and how do they know who to hold accountable when it comes to government inaction or action?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to just start with minority governments and what I see as a huge benefit of minority governments. When we look at some of the policies in Canada that we are most proud of, they came under a minority government. Medicare, Canada Pension Plan, Canada Student Loans, the 40-hour work week, weekends, labor laws, the Equity Marriage Act, the Health Accord. These are just some of the policies that have come in federally under minority governments, because in my view, and you can look at the countries that operate under proportional representation that have a lot of minority governments, is that it focuses on the shared values. It makes the decision making often a much longer horizon that we're looking at, because it's an opportunity for two parties to step out of the election cycle time frame and to look at the longer term, the legacy time frame. What do we want to create together? What will be the legacy of this government? And you know, we see it here in BC. So in the first session in the fall, we banned big money from politics, which was a long overdue piece of policy that needed to happen. We brought in the legislation to enable this referendum, which is you know, such an exciting development. There have been a lot of, there's been, I think the year of politics in BC for me is summarized by, at the beginning, talking to Rob Shaw, and he says, I just don't understand how this can work. How can two parties work together? And I kept saying, well, in every realm, adults work together, right? In every other realm, we expect people to be able to work together, and that's what we're going to do here. He says, no, can't be done. A year later, you know, I hear Rob Shaw on CBC last week saying, well, they seem to work together. I mean, they seem to be doing it, and they don't agree on everything, and it involves push and pull, and nobody's always happy with every decision. But those values, that commitment to serving citizens of BC and future generations, underpins the work that we do together.
You mentioned a little bit about decisions taking a bit longer. There have been examples around the world of kind of long delays when it comes to proportional systems. What is your response to people who have that concern?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the work of government always continues. It's not that government shuts down while parties are deciding how to formulate a coalition or a confidence and supply agreement. And when you look at in many ways, even if there are more governments formed, there are actually often fewer elections in proportional representation systems. So Canada has one of the highest sort of number of elections over time, even though we're in a first-past-the-post system. In a proportional system, you can make an agreement between parties. If that doesn't work out, a new agreement can be reached without going back to an election, so it can actually save money. The other thing it does is because it's more based on consensus building, it means that we don't get what we see in Canada and BC, which are these policy lurches. So you get one party that's in power for a long time, and it moves down an avenue of a certain kind of policy. They get finally, you know, thrown out, as we just saw in Ontario, and you get a party that comes in and says, we're going to undo everything they did, and we're going to do things completely differently. This actually creates economic uncertainty, social uncertainty. It creates worries and concerns for people who are depending on understanding how the system is going to work. Proportionality actually brings less of that lurching from one side to the other, more consistent policies, stronger economic certainty, long-term social certainty. So in essence, by making it so that parties have to work together, we create a more stable landscape.
Well, we now are officially into the campaign as of
Yes.
July 1st, and Elections BC will be playing a role in that. I think our viewers would be interested in how your party, the BC Greens, your campaign and how it will articulate with, we know there'll be some proponents and then the opponents of this, the no and the yes side.
Yeah.
So where's the Green Party going to be working with, say, the yes side campaign? With, there's going to be a network of organizations there. I'm sure the party wants to be seen distinct in one way, but in a sense it'll want to work with like-minded groups. So can you just speak a bit about that?
Absolutely, and so we're still working out all the kinds of details between the different groups and the parties. But for example, I've already been on a panel that had, you know, a Liberal MLA, Bill Teoman, Bruce Halsor, and myself, and so there were 2 pro and 2 against, and that was a panel that allowed that kind of dialogue back and forth. Last weekend I was on a panel with Minister George Heyman in his riding as someone from Fair Vote Canada, and Lindsay Popes from Lead Now. So I expect that there'll be a lot of that kind of coming together, providing opportunities for people to be able to ask questions directly, to be able to work through the details, and have these kinds of conversations. And as you say, you know, we will want a distinct voice, but a distinct voice that is clearly willing to work with everybody on this, because this is such an important piece of, you know, improving our democracy. I sort of put it as, let's vote better. Yeah. We could vote so much better than we do right now. And when I talked to my brother who lives in Ottawa after the election last week, and he described going into the polling booth, and he said, well, my first choice, I wasn't going to vote for because I knew there was no chance he would get elected. My second choice, I wasn't going to vote for because I didn't think she would get elected. I didn't really want to vote for the candidate I voted for, but I did it to stop the candidate I didn't want to get in. And this is the last thing we want in a democracy, is people walking out of a polling booth saying, "Ugh, I can't believe that's what I did."
Yeah. Rather uninspired, strategic voting, very defensive or reactive.
Very, right? Yeah. And what we want, and in some, we want people coming out of their polling booth and just feeling empowered and excited and knowing that they are going to be represented, their views and their visions are going to be represented with the candidate or the party that comes closest to that.
Yeah. So I guess one of the benefits we anticipate would be a rise in interest in voting turnout again, perhaps over the coming years. So what about your party's relationship with the NDP in this campaign? Again, both parties have, through the confidence supply agreement, committed to the referendum. Both going to be in favor of PR of one form or another. So how's that delicate dance going to play out over the coming months?
As I said, so Minister Heyman asked me if I'd come to his riding and be on the panel. Absolutely, I'm happy to be on anybody's panel and to talk about this. I'm so passionate and I really am excited about this. It's not that delicate of a dance, really. It's just people wanting to work together. Right. And I know that the portrayal of politics is often a conflict-driven portrayal, and that's what we've always understood politics to be. I think we can govern better. Right. I think we can do politics better. I really do, and I think we've made some steps towards that. We can make a lot more steps. I truly believe if everybody comes to the table with the best intentions and the greatest desire to serve their constituents as well as all of BC and future generations, we can make awesome decisions that will really help us move towards a shared vision that we have for this province.
Yeah. A few months ago, the Premier said, there's plenty of time to talk about this. In fact, most people, he felt during the summer we're going to be just barbecuing and enjoying holidays. But what are your plans? I'm hearing a lot of passion here, but as an MLA and someone who sees this as a monumental historic opportunity, I have a sense that you're going to be kind of busy this summer on this campaign. And can you tell us a bit more about your plans for
I mean, they're still shaping up, those plans, and but I am already quite busy. I've got a lot of speaking engagements. We'll be doing town halls in my own riding in Cowichan. There's a PR event panel up there on June 20th. Right. And those invitations keep coming in, and I keep saying yes, because this really matters. And I actually want to talk a little bit about why it matters. When I was 10, I went on a trip to Germany, West Germany, with my father. Mm-hmm. He had been born in East Germany. And there was a conference in Leipzig, East Germany. So it's 1980. And we went to that conference in Leipzig. So I went behind the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War as a 10-year-old Canadian-born girl with this concept that the whole world was kind of like Canada, right? And that experience, so being followed everywhere we went, tanks driving down the roads, the young men with the guns and the German shepherds that went under the trains to make sure nobody was hanging onto the bottom of the train trying to escape, and just really understanding that notion of like not being allowed to leave, not being allowed to express opinions, not being allowed to say what you really believed, has deeply informed my passion for democracy. And then that has been reinforced by my studies as a historian and then teaching 20th century history and looking at the way that democracy really flourished and came into its own in the 20th century, but seeing erosion of that happening, and I think there's no shortage of examples of that kind of erosion, and the need that we really must embrace in a democracy to recognize that it's actually our responsibility as every citizen to protect it, to nourish it, to help it to evolve, to meet the current situation and context, and to really recognize it as a gift that can be taken away. And having seen the opposite of democracy, I never want that to be a possibility, and so this is why it matters so much.
Drives so much, yeah.
Yeah.
On this topic of protecting democracy, some critics of proportional representation have the concern that under these systems, smaller parties, fringe parties, or even extremist parties might have a disproportionate amount of power. How would you respond to those kind of concerns?
Yeah, well, I would say that we have some fairly fringe politics happening right now under first past the post south of us. Your electoral system is not the driving force of whether you get extremist views or fringe parties emerging. The single greatest in terms of historically, and I used to teach this to my students, a factor in the rise of extremist thinking is inequality. And when you look at inequality and also the lack of capacity for social movement in countries, it's the US and the UK are at the very top of that spectrum in terms of it's getting harder and harder for social movement to happen within those countries. We and the US and the UK are really the last three major holdouts in first past the post in a world where 85% of OECD countries operate under proportional representation. And so in those countries, what you see is more women elected to parliament, you see more diversity, you see higher markers in terms of voter turnout, in terms of participation in democracy. As I said earlier, our shared values in BC are really what are going to be the driving force of politics under a proportional system. The polarization under a first past the post, which pushes parties to try to identify themselves more and more by what their differences are, that is actually more worrying to me than minority governments and proportional systems where we start to work on our shared values. One small example out of New Zealand where there was an anti-immigration party, and when they were engaged in conversation, and they got a small number of votes and a small number of seats, and they don't become a driving force of policy, but when they were engaged in conversations about why do you hold these views, why are you afraid of immigration, the reality was that it was rooted in the fact that they were afraid of the loss of jobs for New Zealanders. And when policies were brought in that addressed those fears, then those extremist views dissipated. And they started to realize that immigration was not the driving cause of the lack of jobs, that we have policies that can ensure that we can address those problems. So in some ways, making these views part of a participatory democracy, but I'm not worried about extremist views in BC. And the final thing that's really important is there's a 5% threshold that was introduced with the recommendations, which would mean that no party would get seats with less than 5% of the vote. What I do like about the systems that have been brought in is that because there's the first past the post,
Right.
independents can be elected.
Yes.
So somebody like Vicky Huntington, who was a very popular representative for her riding, under this kind of these systems being proposed, she would still very much have the chance to be elected.
Yep.
And I think that that's an important piece to remember. But in terms of extremism, extremism exists under first past the post, and this is not a harbinger of that kind of thing. We actually, it creates far more consensus and shared values.
And if you are successful, if the Yes campaign is successful and we move to proportional system, what is the post-referendum process going to look like? Do you have any concerns about it?
Yeah. So the post-referendum, there's really two major pieces of that. One is that there will be an all-party legislative committee, which will hold committee meetings, which will be public. They will invite experts, and they will sort of fill in the final details of the system, whichever system is chosen by the electorate. The second piece is the Electoral Boundaries Commission, which will determine, as they do after every second election in BC anyways, the Electoral Boundaries Commission will determine the boundaries of the ridings as determined by the system that's been chosen. I think this is a great post-referendum process. I think it's very exciting to have that conversation ongoing. And then finally the recommendations would go back to the legislature and they would be voted on there.
I'm sorry we're out of time. I'm sure we could talk a lot more, but Laurel Collins and myself, Michael Prince, thank you, Sonia Furstenau, for joining us today on Electoral Referendums 2018. Are you voting for change? Thank you again.
Thank you so much.